Hi, welcome back, students. This is Mr. Royer. Today's lesson is going to be on government spending, and this aligns with Chapter 14 in our textbook, Lessons 3 and 4. Before we turn our attention to federal budgets and fiscal policy, we need to take a look at what the federal, state, and local governments are actually spending our money on. We spend a lot of money. Back in 2011, CBS News reported that the federal government spent about $6.85 million per minute. Over the last 5 years, excepting 2020, the federal budget has been around $4.5 trillion. In fiscal year 2020, we set a record. $6.7 trillion were spent, and we only brought in $3.4 trillion in tax revenue. We borrowed a lot of money last year to get out of the pandemic. This worked out to being about $12.7 million a minute. So the main idea today is to explain that the role of federal government has grown significantly, making it a huge player in the economy. We've already talked about how it accounts for nearly 20 to 25% of the GDP. Federal outlays per capita have been growing since World War II, and they continue to grow. Keep in mind, this is a per capita figure, so it isn't just the overall spending, it's the spending per person. So federal spending, including all of these potential options here for 2021, has been growing significantly, and we are looking at a potential $6.5 to $7 trillion budget again this year. Now, this big growth in the last 2 years, 2020 and 2021, is largely due to the pandemic and the fiscal policy response by our federal government. When you combine government spending from 1980 through 2016, you can see that spending has been increasing significantly during this time period. It has nearly doubled. What are we spending that money on? Well, you can see kind of a rough breakdown on this graphic, but we're going to go into a little more detail. In order to understand the federal budget, you need to understand that there's two distinct and separate categories. Mandatory spending, which is outlined on page 222 in your notes, is a government program that was established in the past and is open to anyone who is eligible to receive that benefit. We sometimes refer to these as entitlement programs. If you meet the criteria, you're entitled to receive the money. So the government has to pay these categories under law each year, and we really can't control the growth in the spending in this area of the budget. The big areas here include Social Security, Medicare benefits, veterans benefits, and the interest that we owe on our existing national debt. So these are payments that we largely can't control, but are growing and need to be spent every year. Then there's another portion of the budget known as the discretionary spending. There's some examples outlined on page 221 in your workbooks. With the discretionary part of the budget, the government does have some flexibility. The biggest category in the discretionary portion of our budget is the military budget, the defense spending.
Politicians have their own ideals and plans for how America should be run. And it may not sound like they're talking about money when they're campaigning, but the whole Democrat versus Republican thing is really about where American tax dollars should be going. So before you dive in on either side, it might be a good idea to get a handle on how we the people are currently spending our tax dollars. Before we start, there is a quick thing to note. These numbers are from 2013 and do not include Social Security or Medicare. The money for those programs is determined by the Federal Insurance Contributions Act tax and not the annual budget, so politicians can't do much to change the amount of taxes that go to those programs. Here are the programs that the federal budget does touch. Around 8 cents on every dollar goes toward paying interest on our debt. This is another one that's largely non-negotiable, but it's a significant amount and worth mentioning here. 17 cents out of every dollar is spent on government programs like subsidizing and supporting agriculture, commerce, transportation, and governmental administration, or on science and space technology, things like NASA and the National Science Foundation, international affairs, which includes things like the State Department and all non-military foreign aid. Some of the budget goes to responding to natural disasters or to community and regional development, which includes things like waste disposal and urban development. That 17 cents also goes to the environment, including the Parks Department and managing our natural resources and energy development, or to immigration, border control, and the Justice Department. We also have a program for education and jobs training. All of that combined accounts for the 17 cents out of every income tax dollar. And when you think about how many important programs we just mentioned, it really doesn't seem like a lot. So where is the real money going? Around 50% of our budget goes toward keeping our citizens healthy and out of poverty, which is a pretty good place for it to be. Almost 19 cents on every dollar is spent on jobs and family security. Things like unemployment insurance, food assistance, housing assistance, federal retirement funds, foster care, and temporary assistance for needy families. Veterans benefits also fall into this portion of the budget. They account for an additional 6 cents on every dollar. And healthcare programs like Medicaid, disease control, and numerous others account for an additional 25 cents. Again, that's half the budget. The well-being of our citizenship is something that most politicians can get behind. Something else most politicians can get behind is national defense, which accounts for almost 1/4 of our national budget. But before you get upset about how we are spending almost as much on the military as we are on medical services, let's talk a little bit about where that defense budget actually goes. Yes, the majority of it is spent on building weapons and conducting military operations, but 5.97% of it goes toward personnel salaries and benefits. That 6 cents is literally how we are supporting our troops. Some of that defense budget is also going towards maintaining our nuclear defense capabilities, and another portion of it is going to defense-related FBI activities. Plus, the U.S. military has almost 16,000 square miles of bases and facilities to maintain. So that 24.79% isn't all going towards bombs and invasions. Some of it is just there to maintain the troops, bases, and equipment we already have.
Okay, so as you can see from the video, we spend a lot of money on a lot of different things, but where does all that money come from? In fiscal year 2015, you can see the largest source of revenue for the federal government was actually borrowing. We had to borrow 37% of the money we spent that year. Personal income tax comprised of most of the tax revenue at 26%. Social Security, Medicare, and unemployment payroll taxes made up about 1/4. And then the rest came from miscellaneous other taxes. In fiscal year 2013, we only spent $3.5 trillion, but again, we spent roughly 1/4 of that on Medicare, 1/4 on Social Security. The Defense Department made up about 19%, and net interest was only 6%. But notice, the entire rest of the federal program only accounted for about 17% of the non-defense discretionary budget. The U.S. does spend more on our defense than the next 7 countries combined, and you can see that graphic here. These numbers are from 2015. And the defense spending does account for roughly half of all of the discretionary portion of the federal budget. When you look at the entire budget together, we have revenue or income, and then spending or expenditure or outcome. Now this figure is from 2010. At the time, this was the largest budget ever passed, and we also had the record largest deficit of $1.27 trillion. It seems relatively small compared to the $3.5 trillion we spent last year, deficit last year. But again, you can see the largest source of revenue was the individual income tax, followed by the payroll taxes, and then the deficit spending, which was borrowed money. On the spending side, the discretionary portion of the budget, defense spending is the largest, and on the mandatory spending side, it was Social Security, Medicare, and the interest on the debt. The biggest drivers of growth in federal spending are actually healthcare and Social Security. This would be Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest on our national debt, which is getting larger. Notice, this is in part because we're an aging population. As we continue to age, we're spending more and more on Social Security and Medicare. And since we keep borrowing more and more money, the percent of the budget that's going to be spent on servicing that debt, the interest we have to pay, is going to continue to grow as well. So again, you can see the only way to really address growth in the federal budget is to start to attack some of these social programs and look at how we're funding them. We'll talk more about that in our next lesson on federal budget. Now, state and local governments also collect tax revenue and spend money. And state and local governments are becoming a larger and more important part of our public sector spending. In fact, a majority of the growth in government employment is actually not at the federal level, but at the state and local level. The federal employment levels remain pretty flat over the past half century, even though the population has doubled. When we're dealing with state and local sources of revenue and spending, there's going to be a lot of variance depending on what state and local government we're looking at. Here in Pennsylvania, most of our revenue comes from a combination of income tax, sales tax, and user fees. Local governments get a lot of real estate tax, that's the property tax, income tax, sales tax, and user fees. Pennsylvania's largest source of revenue is the individual income tax. In Pennsylvania, we pay a proportional tax where every Pennsylvanian pays the same percent of their income, and that makes up about 40%. Sales tax, which is 6% throughout the state, is the second largest category. The state spends most of its money on education, health and human services, corrections, which is the Department of Prisons, and the transportation, that'd be the federal highways like PennDOT. Our operating budget has been growing in Pennsylvania, and notice our budget is today just over $75 billion. Local governments in Pennsylvania include county governments, municipal governments, which are either townships, cities, or boroughs, depending on where you live. They have their top spending priority on education, roads, and public safety, or police. Major sources of revenue here include real estate taxes, which largely finance school districts and local and county governments. So to summarize, the largest categories of government revenue and spending are on the screen. For the federal level, largest tax revenue comes from the personal income tax and payroll tax, and the major expenses on the mandatory side are Social Security, Medicare, and interest on the national debt. On the discretionary side, defense spending. For the state level, it's a combination of income tax and sales tax, and the major expenses are healthcare, education, public welfare, roads, and prisons. Locally, it's the property tax, income tax, and sales tax that make up the bulk of revenue. Expenses include education, public safety, police, and roads. In our next lesson, we're going to be taking a look at the federal budget process and how the budget can be used to help iron out macroeconomic problems. This is the idea we refer to as fiscal policy. So, until next time, have a great day.